Good afternoon, everyone. I really do want to welcome you to this final installation of season 4 of Red Talks. When the provost and I launched Red Talks nearly 5 calendar years ago now, we both knew that Seattle University was uniquely fortunate to have so many exceptional faculty voices who could shine light on our ongoing interconnected journey. It has been my privilege to play a role in highlighting these incredible thought leaders on our faculty, uncommon voices on topics that matter. And so let's quickly take a look back at some of the past highlights from seasons 1 through 3. Red Talks are back.
I was taught that much of my life as a Black man would be about survival.
My young self didn't think I belonged on stage most of the time.
The only all-female cabinet that we know of is one that is in fiction.
If I express myself authentically, I'll be stereotyped.
I think we're encouraged to believe that someone else is coming to save us. And that is just not happening.
Step into the arena to grapple with vulnerability.
We seek to harness the power of our differences.
You are who you are because of your experiences.
In order for healing to happen, engage your own body and look for the wisdom that we have within our body.
Love is about being transformative.
Be courageous and exhibit the kind of love that changes our organization.
Building that culture takes each and every single person.
Recognize that we are enough and that we will always be enough.
I would always advocate that no matter what you do and who you are, that you seek your narrative and that you make sure that you advocate for that.
Keep hope alive. Yes, thank you. So this is a container that we co-create together, and it is one that I'm very proud of. And you can find the catalog for the previous 3 seasons of Red Talks on the website. So Red Talks offers us a rare opportunity in our very overly full lives to dig deep, to not only connect with ideas and research and critical concepts, but to spend time immersed in them together as a community. In a soundbite fast food world, Red Talks gives us pause for a collective contemplation and growth. I have personally learned from each of the speakers who have stepped onto this stage to share their experiences and their expertise. And I know that today's talk will be a stellar addition to that lineage. My hope is that this season of Red Talks encourages you to find out more and provides fuel and inspiration for you as you engage in the important work of creating a just and humane world. Our Jesuit Catholic mission and values invite us to offer our gifts, discover those in others, as we get about the work of making this world more loving, more just, and more equitable. This is a collaborative endeavor, and all of us here today are partners, committing to work together and to walk together. This Red Talk comes at a fortuitous time, a time when we are both open and thoughtful as we reflect upon the wisdom offered to us just this past week at Mission Day. This season of Red Talks, we requested that each of our speakers address one of the 3 great challenges that President Peñalver named in Seattle University's strategic plan, Reigniting Our Strategic Directions. 1, rapid technological change and its societal and economic impacts. We had that in fall with Professor Onur Bakiner. Racial injustice and widening inequality. We were fortunate to be able to engage in that topic just in winter quarter with Professor Charisse Cowan-Petrie. And today, Professor Rodriguez, who has long been engaged with work intimately and meaningfully at the center of the 3rd great challenge, sustainability and climate change. Thinking about and writing about our interdependence as human beings in relationship to bring forth ecological justice. And we will hear her expansive interpretation of that in just a moment. For those of you who were able to join us at Mission Day last week, her speech will offer resonance with the observations of writer Robin Wall Kimmerer, and without a doubt, aid us along the path to solidarity in sustainability. I want to take a quick moment to thank those who make this magic happen, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion team, as well as some of our campus partners, including marketing and communications, and our external partner who is here providing this lovely platform for us today, FreshMade. It is now my honor and my pleasure to introduce my partner in sponsoring Red Talks, Provost Shane Martin.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. And good afternoon, and thank you for everyone for joining us today for the concluding Red Talk of Season 4. Spending time together as a community is both gratifying and energizing. This particular Red Talk comes with divine timing in many ways, on the heels of the inspiring Mission Day, as Natasha referenced, which encouraged ourselves to connect with each other and with our earth. Dr. Jeanette Rodriguez, her topic coincides beautifully with the themes that we heard last week, while bringing her own insight and brilliance to bear as she speaks on the topic, La Tierra, Home, Identity, and Destiny, a Latina's perspective on integral ecology. We live in a society which tries to instill on artificial juxtapositions, a society that gravitates towards binaries to make sense of reality. Left or right, work or home, mind or body, us or them, nurture, nature. But our Jesuit and Catholic spirituality urges us to see complexity and divinity where much of the world insists on reductionistic simplicity. The celebrated writer Madeleine Lang once claimed that it is the task of the artist to find cosmos in the chaos. I would expand upon this assertion as scholars and lifelong learners, as key agents in the Jesuit and Catholic tradition. It is in fact our sacred task to bring forth cosmos from chaos, to uncover points of conjunction and the beautiful complexity in our world and in one another. Red Talks as a whole, and this particular Red Talk, honors our spiritual imperative and offers us a glimpse of that transcendent cosmos, that divine complexity. And so I'm especially honored to introduce Professor Jeanette Rodriguez. Jeanette Rodriguez is a professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. She serves as executive director of the Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture and holds the Malcolm and Mari Stamper Endowed Chair in Catholic and Intellectual Cultural Traditions. She also co-chairs the Laudato Si Action Platform, which is one of Seattle U's major ways in which we respond to the changes in our environment that you'll hear more about today. Dr. Rodriguez is the author of several books and articles concentrated in the areas of U.S. Hispanic theology, theologies of liberation, peace building, and women's spirituality. Her works include the groundbreaking Our Lady of Guadalupe, Faith and Empowerment Among Mexican-American Women, which in fact turned conventional theology on its head, presenting Our Lady of Guadalupe as a radical icon of feminist liberation. Also, Stories We Live, the reader in Latina feminist theology, and Cultural Memory, Resistance, Faith, and Identity, and A Clan Mother's Call. Most recently, she's co-authored a book with Professor Sharon Callahan, entitled Women Called to Catholic Priesthood, From Ecclesial Challenge to Spiritual Renewal. Dr. Rodriguez has served as a board member for the Academy of Hispanic Theologians in the United States and as vice chair for Pax Christi USA. She holds a PhD in religion and personality sciences from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jeanette Rodriguez.
Good afternoon, everyone, friends and colleagues. Thank you for coming. I'd like to give a special thank you to Natasha, where are you? Natasha Martin and her team for inviting me to be part of the series about lifting up uncommon voices. The topic today is La Tierra, home, identity, and destiny, a Latina's perspective on integral ecology. Some of you might are familiar with this term, integral ecology, with all our work on Laudato Si on campus. The Catholic Climate Covenant helps us with this definition, integral ecology, a vision that sees and underlines the interconnectedness of environmental, economic, political, social, cultural, and ethical issues. Foundationally, it's about relationships, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. In my talk, there's two things I want to emphasize. One, the need to expand our consciousness, and two, to see everything in relationship to one another, whether we're talking about our relational self, or we're talking about our self with other, we're talking about self with creation, self with God or higher power, self with the universe. There's an American scientist named David Bown, and he wrote that the ability to perceive or to think differently is more important, and this is a hard thing for a university professor to say, is more important than knowledge. Because what he's talking about here is the ability to navigate between epistemological positions, right? The ability to navigate, right, between these different perspectives. We, as human beings, see the world in very specific ways based on our own social location and all the other factors that shape the way we think, the way we act, the way we respond to things. So for example, my social location is that I'm a New Yorker by birth. My ancestral home is the Andes, in particular Ecuador. I'm the daughter of mestizo immigrant parents, that is Iberian and indigenous of the Quechua people, and I live in Coast Salish land here on Turtle Island. The issues that we face require new perspectives, new ways of thinking, and I'm grateful that I'm bilingual, bicultural, bicognitive, and that I've had to learn to navigate between these epistemological positions. And while at times it was very painful growing up, I'm grateful to have this awareness, because the more awareness we have, the more choices we have. So in order to expand our understanding of integral ecology, I braid like a trenza, a braid, home, identity, and destiny within the embrace of La Tierra. Earth is our first and our oldest home. Place, identity, is a concept that was developed by environmental psychology and social geography to convey that sense of personal attachment to a geographical, locatable place through which a person acquires a sense of belonging and purpose, which gives meaning to one's life. Yet many in our contemporary society have this homeless feeling, often articulated as not belonging. We hear this even in our students. There is an aloneness out of which they speak, right, that one must respond to. So home, we usually ask one another where you're from, right? Or we might, or where you spent your formative years, or where do you go for the holidays? Home is often where we find our families and our friends and those landscapes where we learned about the world. And many of us look back to our original homes or our ancestral homes with longing. Some people think of home as that place you're going to go to when you step into eternity, right? I'm going home. When I was a young girl, my mother told me a story of her own immigration story, her migration story to the United States from Cuenca, Ecuador. And she told me it was a 15-hour plane flight. It was a time when the planes didn't have any frills, right? It was long, no snacks. And she told us that when she came down from the plane, right, and she felt herself weak in the knees, and that by the time she placed her foot on this land, she felt que todo el sangre me salió del cuerpo, that all the blood was drained from my body. That image of being drained of one's life blood symbolizes the consequence of our removal from the land that gives meaning and identity. So would a reclaiming of the knowledge of earth, in fact, our first and oldest home, have an impact, maybe shift our experience of displacement and aloneness? This ancestral memory, it's deep within us. And if we're to recall that wisdom of that memory, we need to be able to stand firmly on the earth in reverential silence and recall the interdependence and intricate relationship that we have with the world, with earth, with the universe. So imagine if we could broaden our definition. Ay, ¿qué pasó? Broaden our definition. It might go something like this. Jeanette Rodriguez, ancestral home, the Andes, presently on Coast Salish, Turtle Island, Earth, soul system, Milky Way, galaxy, universe. What would that do if we started to identify ourselves like that? A colleague of mine, Christine Painter, she's a theologian in Ireland, she wonders if we live in what she calls an age of forgetting, an age of forgetting. We've forgotten who we are in relationship to everything else. Creatures, plants, the mountains, the rivers, the oceans, one another, even ourselves. With every plastic we discard, she writes, with every poison we release on the land and in the water, with every fossil fuel extracted, we're living in that fog of amnesia. And what is it that we're forgetting? We forget that we emerge from earth, that creation as a sacred place is the foundation of all existence. Nature and creation are the original cathedrals, the original temple, says the mystics. Every Christian tradition has maintained that we've received two books, right? One is the scripture, and the other is the book of creation. And we need both in order to grow both in wisdom and in humanity. And in many ways, the rhythm of our lives are like the seasons. As with the seasons, we feel and experience the rise and the fall of life. Spring invites us to blossom forth. Summer calls us to our own ripening. Autumn demands that we release and let go. And winter quietly whispers to us to rest, to sink into that dark, fertile space of knowing. All of us are profoundly affected, sometimes without even being aware of it, by the many places that we've been, that we've spent our lives. And this relationship with the land, however, cannot be separated from one's relationship with family and community and culture and even the cosmos. So a lovely and powerful example of this relationship that the land has is the concept of the three sisters. How many of you are familiar with this? Yes, the three sisters. These are crops that are planted together in a shared space: maize or corn, beans, and squash. And they're developed through the indigenous agricultural practices, and these plants, they protect and they nurture each other in different ways. And they provide a solid diet for their cultivators. So they get planted so that the beans wrap itself around the corn, and the squash leaves gives the plants a shadow, right? And these plants live and thrive better together than they would alone. right? This is not just a simple, cute little cultural anecdote, no? This is an agricultural strategy or technology. And it's also a cultural complex, complete with stories, ceremonies, technology, customs, etiquette. So that we come to see that the recognition of the earth as la sagrada tierra, the sacred land, it permeated the life and the spirituality of indigenous peoples. Their worldview held all things in relationship with one another. And in this understanding, we are part of that web of life and dependent on each other, not just for survival, but as a hope for our community. La tierra's identity. I love this quote. Who we understand ourselves to be will have consequences of how we experience and understand the world. So when I was growing up in New York, the projects of New York, I and my brothers, more so my brothers because they're darker than I am, were called derogatory names, let's say. And one of them was half-breed. And it wasn't until I got to college and had a wonderful teacher and mentor who told me that I wasn't a half-breed, but that in fact, I was a new creation. That shifted for me how I stood in the world. For many indigenous peoples, la tierra as home is experienced even more profoundly and holistically and inseparably from identity. Their relationship with the land isn't just one of sustenance and livelihood. It encompasses a deep sense of community, spirituality, and identity. You've heard many indigenous peoples from around the world refer to Earth as our mother, Pachamama. Right? All living creatures are related and referred to as brothers and sisters. In the culture, worlds for each indicate a sharing and a belonging, not a possessing and an owning. Humans are not separate from nature. All are one. And when humans think about how to care for Earth, we must begin to recognize that we are nature, that we are of Earth. All beings are connected and we are one. Trees and forests, for example, they communicate with each other through this very fascinating network of symbiotic relationships and chemical signaling. They share water and nutrients through their networks, and they use them to communicate. Scientists tell us that they even send stress signals when there's an incoming drought or disease. Spiritually, trees also help us to become aware of our connections with something larger than ourselves. Ecologist Susan Simard tells us that trees are social creatures and that they communicate with each other in cooperative ways. And this is an insight that holds lessons for humans. The symbiotic relationship with land is told in many stories across cultures. One of my favorites is one I heard when I was lecturing in South Africa. And the story is about the lost girl. So it's a girl, she lost her way, she moved away from the campsite where her aunties and mothers and grandmothers and fathers and uncles and grandfathers were. And she had hidden in the shadow of a rock and fallen asleep while she waited, hoping for her brothers and sisters to find her. They didn't. Now, it was night, and no one answered when she called. She couldn't find her way back to the camp. The girl wandered alone. She grew thirsty, so she stopped at the water hole to drink. And then she got hungry, so she picked some berries from the bush. Then the night grew colder, so she huddled beneath an overhanging rock, pressing herself in the hollow that had trapped that warm air during the day. Finally, she saw a crow flapping from tree to tree. So she followed it. She followed him through the trees and over the rocks and up the hills until at last she saw the glow of her people's campfires in the distance. And the people laughed and they cried to see that she was safe. Some of them growled at her for her foolishness. Others cuddled her because she was back. They gave her a place by the fire. And then her little brother came up and said, were you frightened, right? Were you afraid? Her response, how could I be frightened? I was with my mother. When I was thirsty, she gave me water. When I was hungry, she fed me. When I was cold, she warmed me. And when I was lost, she showed me the way home. What a way to perceive, right, reality and its implications. If one acknowledges this relationship, then like any relationship, it can be nurtured, right? But it can also be offended. We can hurt each other, right? And so I have a story about this Catholic priest who arrived in a community hidden in the ravines of Mexican Southeast. And before saying Mass, he opened up shop to hear confessions. And in the Tololoa language that the Indians spoke, through a translator, they told their sins. And here they are. He says he abandoned his corn. He says the cornfield is very sad. Many days since he last went. Next, he says he abused the fire. He cursed the flames because they didn't glow brightly. He says he defiled the path, cutting back undergrowth when there was no need. He said he hurt the ox. He said he chopped a tree without telling it why. The priest had no idea what to do with these sins because they didn't appear anywhere on Moses' list. Mysteries? Perhaps. But today, with our more expanded consciousness, we learn from quantum physics how everything in the universe, or in multiple universes, is connected with everything else. We humans are not separate from the air, the water, the soil. We are neither autonomous nor independent from the bacteria that sustains all life on Earth, from the plant which nourishes our bodies and spirit, from the many creatures with whom we share our home. In fact, there is no such thing as autonomy or independence in this universe. Quantum physics has blown apart our old image of independent life forms making their way in a competitive and hostile world. This interconnectedness of all things highlights our personal responsibility for the actions and the impacts that they have on the world around us. It means that every choice we make, every action we take has a consequence, and what we don't do has a consequence that can affect not only ourselves, but other people, animals, the environment, etc. One of quantum physics' amazing discovery is that at the subatomic particle level, these exist not by themselves, but in relationship to one another. The existence of these particles cannot be defined except in their relationship with one another. The experience of Earth as home and the experience of Earth as identity lead us to the awareness of Earth as destiny, our destiny as human beings, and the dignity of the Earth as one, and the destiny of the Earth as one. People all over the globe are coming to understand that we cannot continue to use without limit the resources of the Earth. All great religious traditions recognize and acknowledge that life is a sacred gift. Humanity is called to recognize the need for changes in our lifestyle, our production, our consumption. Science and religion, with their distinctive approaches to understanding reality, can enter into an intense dialogue, fruitful for both. We're grateful for the 2015 encyclica written by Pope Francis. In this encyclica, he begins by invoking the spirit of St. Francis of Assisi, who reminds us that our common home is like a sister. St. Francis is known throughout religious traditions for being a mystic. He saw everything in relationship to one another. If you read and hear his language, brother sun, sister moon, sister death, right? All was given this dignity of being in relationship, and now we're told that the sister cries out to us because of the harm that we've inflicted. Pope Francis reminds us that, quote, a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk about this need to shift, to expand our consciousness, it's echoed in Francis's remarks, given the complexity of the ecological crisis and its multiple causes. We need to realize that solutions will not emerge from just one way of interpreting or transforming reality. For the believer, we understand better the importance and the meaning each creature has within the entirety of God's plan. God wills interdependence of creatures, the sun, the moon, the flower, the eagles, etc. And finally, integral ecology is inseparable from the notion of the common good. And the notion of the common good must extend to future generations. And here's something we've learned from our Native brothers and sisters, that we make these decisions, think of the next 7 generations. No? So La Tierra joins the voices of ecologists, scientists, mystics, indigenous wisdom to reclaim and reinterpret symbols and imagine new hope and ways to confirm life. So I'd like to offer that this concept of La Tierra offers a couple of reflective thoughts. No? One, it honors the subject. It respects the language and the affectivity of the heart. It realizes that the importance of teaching our future generation how to humanize their will. And to increase one's ability to understand and draw from an intuitive nature of thinking that is dynamic and fluid and creative and searching and excludes no one. So I've braided these themes of home, identity, and destiny under the canopy of La Tierra to demonstrate the interconnectedness and radical openness to all, placing as paramount the work of relationships, so that along with the scientists and the mystics and indigenous wisdom, we embrace the truth that everything is connected and no one is saved alone. Thank you.
We'd like to invite you to come down and ask Professor Rodriguez any questions that you might have.
Hola.
Hola, ¿cómo estás? Hace mucho tiempo.
Qué bueno verte.
¿Te gustó?
So my question is more related to this interconnectedness and the effect of climate change and migration, particularly. As you know, I'm from Puerto Rico, and one of the things that has happened, anybody here?
Yeah. Yay, Puerto Rico!
I think there's only 2 of us in the whole university, right? So in the case of Puerto Rico, we went through Maria, and every time I go back, there's less and less people. The migration has been extraordinary because it basically, devastated the whole agricultural sector. And of course, to live without water for 3 months had an impact. And I'm part of all these Facebook pages of people that, miss the island. I mean, it's just terrible what has happened to Puerto Rico, which is, by the way, part of the United States, and traumatic. And itself, when you see the connection between climate change and migratory tendencies that probably we also see in the United States, and the lack of understanding of how these things have affected agriculture and, survival, right? So what is your thought of that? How has that affected particularly Latin America, and how that reflects on the migratory patterns to the north, right? To those areas that have not yet been affected?
Well, as I said earlier, you can't just talk about one thing, right? It's so complex, right? How do we begin to unblend, right? All the factors that are involved in what you're describing, But I can tell you that what we say in Latin America is when the United States gets a cold, we get pneumonia, right? So how would understanding the relationship, right? All the relationships that I've been trying to lift up here in this little talk, right? How might we respond differently? How might we respond differently? We're not going to be able to cure what's going on right now, right? We might be able to slow the process, right? We may be able to start introducing to our children and our grandchildren certain practices that might help us, but in many ways the damage is done, right? So how do we respond, right, to that damage, right? What needs to happen, right? And for that, you need to ask the people. You need to, a lot of times, when I was living on Guam and Micronesia, during one of our hurricanes, I forgot what agency, some humanitarian agency, they dropped off food on the island. They dropped it. And it was like Spam, right? Nobody eats Spam right there, right? I mean, so there was no sense of understanding, right, the culture. But worse, they didn't ask the people, right? Ask the people what they need. Yeah.
Or paper towels, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone else? You don't have to have a question. If you have a comment, that's fine too. Hi, Kathleen.
Thank you, Jeanette. That was, as you were giving this really beautiful presentation, I was thinking, and wonder if you have any thoughts about this, that so much of particularly American and Western culture in their movies and books and films present the earth, and particularly the ocean, as a threat, as something that holds horrors or terrors. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how that attitude that kind of can permeate our culture and what we experience and how, like, what we see, how we get from that to this sense of La Tierra as the mother.
One of the great insights I learned from Jesuit Father Kovenbach was that he said, content is important, but as important is contact, right? And I speak for myself too. Before I went back to my parents' ancestral land, I grew up in the projects of New York. I never even went to camp. What did I know, right? And as I got older and I got to travel, right, and I became a scuba diver, right, I discovered a whole world under the ocean, full of color and life and movement. Now that wouldn't have happened, right, had I not had the opportunity or the experience to have contact with something else, something different, right? Why do you think that, well, I can talk only about New York, they always push to get donations to send city kids to camp, right? Right? To have them have access to something, right? So I don't have the answers to any of these questions, but I do know that we have to have contact as well as content, right? We know this from our own teaching with our students. They learn best not just having the content, but when they are engaged in some kind of community relationship experience with people, right? It stays with them.
The provost just deferred to my question. That's not how that's normally supposed to work. So I have been thinking about the context in which we're educating our students in a world where we have global challenges, and we're also seeing people trying to retrench to nationalism or even tribes within nations. I'm wondering how your work can speak effectively to our work as a university in taking those various levels of perspective you described, from where you were born to the universe, and take that into the social context. How do we learn to take La Tierra and think about our common home as humanity?
The first thing that comes to mind is that I would say to learn from our students who come here that are not from here necessarily, right? Or those students who are from here who have an experience, right, of the land. You know how when we have a class and we have the students introduce themselves, right? Usually it's your name, your major, what year you're in. Is that right? Is that what we usually do? Yeah. So what I do in my class is I have a little exercise that's called I am from. And it's 4 sentences. And they have to fill it out. So I am from, right? And I want them to describe the landscape that they grew up in. And I am from, and I want them to remember the foods and the smells that they grew up with, right? And I am from, and it's just 4 sentences. And what happens is that these students put out this beautiful, what comes out to be poetry, right? And the students most affected at the affective level, that is, they get very emotional, are those students who have a relationship with the land, right? Who have a relationship with what it means, right, to engage the other in an intimate way, right? And so how can we provide those conceptual spaces, right, for both faculty, staff, and students to share their various experiences, again, in order to expand one's consciousness, but without blame or judgment. See, this is probably the hardest thing that we have to deal with as educators, that somehow we've gotten the message that different always means better or worse, not just different, right? And it doesn't mean you have to come on the other side of whatever that person believed, but ask yourself, in what way, to what extent does hearing this other way of understanding the world, of filtering the world, of responding to the world, right, open up for us a way of being in the world, right, that's less hostile, less judgmental, less prejudicial, all right? So some people might laugh at, oh, three sisters, no? But if I talk about it from a scientific point of view, they're like, oh, very profound, right? But what I'm trying to do in this talk is to emphasize the importance of relationships, right?
First of all, thank you, Jeanette, for such an inspiring set of reflections on La Tierra. Kind of following up on Bob's question about what your message says to us at Seattle University, you stepped in and agreed to co-lead Seattle University's Laudato Si initiative, not because at this point in your career you have nothing to do, but because it was something that resonated with you and that you believed in, both in terms of the different tenets, and you talked about a few of them, but also because this is part of a global initiative really sponsored or called by no less than Pope Francis. Could you say more, though, about Laudato Si itself? What does it promise for institutions like Seattle University? How can we more fully think about and embrace Laudato Si? What are we doing well in this area, and what are areas that we could continue to grow in as we journey on this 7-year journey with the rest of the world in Laudato Si?
So, in the interest of time, there's two things that I think of immediately. So, one, Catholics don't have the corner on environmental justice, right? If anything, the Pope lends his voice as a religious leader to voices that have already been speaking about the need to pay attention to this, right? And his goals on the 7-year journey is important because it's integrative. I've said this before, that the language of integral ecology in English is, I think, new for many people, but not in Latin America, where the Pope is from, right? We talk about ecología integral, right? So we know, like the braid, things are integrated, no? And so, as the Pope said, and as we're seeing, you can't talk about one without the other, right? You can't talk social without political. You can't talk political without economic, right? And so there's a more systemic way of both looking at something and responding, right? The same thing happens to us as an institution, Seattle U. To what extent and for how long did one department not know what the other department is doing, or what one unit is not doing, what one unit is doing versus the other unit? If anything, I think Laudato Si has provided a medium by which we can come together systemically and start talking to one another, and start collaborating with one another, and start sharing resources with one another for the common good, in this case, the educational endeavor of Seattle University, no? So I think those two things for me come up right away, right? The integration of the social, political, economic, cultural, and even for us, how we operate systemically, now as an institution. Right? We already have the charism, the Jesuit charism of understanding the curas personales, right? The importance of the person, the dignity of the person, yes. How can we more profoundly create those conceptual spaces for that wisdom to be shared, right? So that's my immediate response.
Thank you again for just magnificent instruction insight. I was curious about, you mentioned growing up in New York that you didn't have a lot of contact with the land. What was it like for you? I'd love to hear about your experience when you went from being a city girl to, having this new relationship. What was that like for you, and what was the process?
So because my mother never got accustomed to being in this country, she would go back to Ecuador every few years. And it had to be every few years because it's very expensive, right? And she would take me with her. And I remember the first time I went, and we went to, what do you call it? We call it cloud forest. I think you call it rainforest, but we call it cloud forest because we're 14,000 feet above sea level, so the clouds sit right in the forest. So, and so we went to the cloud forest because my mother knew about herbal medicine, and there's a tree in the cloud forest where you can get something called sangre de dragón. It's called the blood of the dragon, but it's used for healing purposes, no? But the first time I went with her to get those herbs, there was someone playing the pan flute, right? One of the indigenous people, they were playing the pan flute. But I was in the midst of clouds, right? So what happened was that I was transported really to an altered state of consciousness, right? It was almost a mystical experience to walk through this forest, right? In the mist with this beautiful sound. Right? Beautiful sound. So it's those kind of moments, I think, and I'm sure everybody has a moment like that, where the first time maybe that, I don't know, they saw the sunrise. Although I have to tell you a funny story. When I first moved to Seattle, one of my colleagues wanted to take me hiking to Mount Rainier. And I said, okay. So we went up to Mount Rainier, and I didn't say anything. And then he goes, well? And I went, nice. And he goes, nice? And I go, well, I'm from the Andes. Right? This is nice, right? So he was very upset with me. He never took me hiking again. So those mystical, I encourage you to seek out those mystical experiences. It'll change your consciousness. Yeah? Hello?
Thank you, Professor. You kind of talked a little bit about the importance of integrating multiple perspectives on kind of connecting with the earth and just the different components that really go into that. I'm currently a biology student, and I feel like there's still this disconnect where in a lot of my science classes, we talk about the scientific perspective. In a bunch of U-cores, it's a little more on the cultural, and we get a little bit more depth of that. I'm wondering what you have as a faculty member, like kind of what is your perspective on how we can better integrate that and kind of have that dialogue not only between students, but between like faculty members as well?
Okay, this is like off the cuff, right? Without much reflection. We need money. We need money so we can do team teaching, right? Imagínate, if we could have a biologist, a cultural anthropologist, I don't know, ecofeminist, teaching you, right? So go out there and get us some money.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you for that moving, inspiring, really spiritual, wise exhortation on our interconnectedness and how perspective taking and relationship building is key to our survival and to saving not only our planet, but ourselves. And so I am in deep gratitude to you for saying yes to this. I remember the day that both Laura and I had a long conversation with you, that you would be just the person that we would want to end our season 4 Red Talks, and it did not disappoint. So join me in thanking Professor Rodriguez. And as a small token of our appreciation, we have flowers for you and a frame poster of the Red Talk advertisement. And so I do want to thank everyone for being here and really wishing you well for the rest of this week, but also hoping you will take with you La Tierra theology and incorporate it in your lives here at the university and your work with our students and one another. So thank you and be well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.